Thank you for joining the Resilient Cyber Show. My name is Chris Hughes, and today I'm joined by Andres Vega and Andrew Clay Shafer. Gentlemen, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, definitely. I'm excited to chat with both of you. Before we dive into that, though, for folks that may not have seen any of your guys' content or conversations or talks, do you mind telling us a bit about your background? Maybe, Andrew, you want to hop in there first?
Sure. So there's my association with the DevOps, if you will, going back to working on Puppet in the early days of that. But before that, I was a software developer working on venture-funded startups. Got into this problem of trying to do these deployments and maintaining all these different environments and having all the classic problems that you run into doing that. Got more and more focused on operations, and then just had this, what I would consider like very unique perspective to watch a bunch of the internet being built going back to 2004, 2005. Puppet was started in 2004. By 2008, it was being used at Google, it was being used at Twitter. Got to watch a lot of that stuff. And then now in the last 10 years, shifted more and more to focusing on enterprise. So I spent 5 years at Pivotal, and then I just left Red Hat. So I spent about not quite 3 years at Red Hat, focused on trying to help organizations solve some of these same problems. And then I won't get to the punchline, and Andres can also address a lot of this, but at some point, all this investment in automation starts to run into a bunch of the problems that we're going to talk about today. So got to watch all those problems in real time over the last 2 decades.
How about you, Andres?
Yeah. So I entered the industry close to a decade and a half ago at a time where DevOps was unfolding, but the stark reality was that we had all this litter and all this legacy, which in large part we still have today. No environment is legacy free. And there's really strong aspiration of where do we want to go next? But how do we carry this baggage? Do we divest with it? I've pretty much occupied every single possible role at technology companies you can have, for the exception of software developer. So I've been in all the ancillary supporting functions, primarily as a product manager, but different paths, different exposure to different areas eventually took me there. Worked both in large, big corporations, as well as a few startups. And the realization of there's so much toil and so much waste that unless we come upon a reckoning act, something we talked about in the book, Investments Unlimited, which reconnected us, Chris, unless we really come together, we don't have a happy ending, or we don't get to break our way. And how do we align those incentives and do more together to get to the places we want to be, do the things that we want to do, and just be able to enjoy the weekends without dreading going back to work and picking up where we left, if we're not having to answer the pager during that time.
Yeah, I think that would be a message many of us can get behind, at least myself for sure. And you kind of you kind of jumped ahead, like the book Investments Unlimited, by the way, definitely check it out. It's a little blurry on my screen, but from IT Revolution, kind of in their typical fashion, where they tell you in a novel with characters and a storyline, a plot, all those good things. It makes it more relatable and more enjoyable to read, in my opinion. And Andres was a contributing author to that, and then Andrew knows many of the authors as well as personal friends and former colleagues.
I consider myself the patron of this book.
There you go. So I guess sticking with the book for a moment before we dive into like the nitty gritty of the topic, what was the impetus for the book? Kind of what led you guys to make this book, and how did you get everyone together?
Yeah, for sure. Well, some credit goes to Andrew for being an instigator of change, but observing, we go back 18 months ago at a time where a lot of the regulation language was being revised. We're seeing CMMC push for zero trust and suddenly training the range of 20,000 auditors to go look for zero trust policy assertions. But the lack of means to actually produce those attestations, we're seeing the SEC update the language of having to the time frame to disclose a vulnerability shifting towards practically immediately, and SRE teams saying, well, we don't even find out right away that this happens. and reassessing and rethinking what is the act of compliance. At its essence is, are we doing the thing we said we would do? We think we are, but how do we prove it? How do we demonstrate it? And with technology and where we're at with cloud doing so much more, it's so much harder to prove it. We don't have the means across the board to yield this evidence and say, hey, look, this is how we're doing it. Like, it's how we think so, but how do we go and prove it? We haven't written it down, or if we wrote it down, it's drifted. Can we keep records of this? Can we meet this raised requirements from the regulators and all this new language, and prevent all this running around and fires and frustration and response to that? So John Willis, mutual acquaintance, tagged me along. I had prior experience writing books with many other authors, collaborative knowledge production. He brought me in for that, and also some of my perspective, participation in the open source community. I moonlight as a technical leader for the Cloud Native Security Foundation, bring a lot of that cloud native security perspective onto the book. The rest of the authors, unique and exceptional individuals, tons of perspective, tons of experience. So it was a lot of fun to share all of our observations and how do we drive, well, what's worked for us, externalize and share that with the rest so we can have better outcomes.
Yeah, that makes
so
sense.
I would say the reason is it's time, right? There's all this other experience and work that builds up to this point. So you have the DevOps Enterprise Summit has had these kind of conversations. You have the DevOps Automated Governance paper that's been out there for a while. And this is taking some of those lessons and putting into that format, like you referenced, the Phoenix project, this kind of like novel to kind of capture some of that in a way that some people like to consume it. I would also say, from my perspective, working in, we'll call it the coalface level of this, you basically run into governance, risk, and compliance in any of these regulated industries. So lots of stuff that was, in the early DevOps conversations was really focused on building the big web. It was the Wild West, and the problem you're trying to solve is putting cat pictures on the internet. As you get into some of these other environments, some of these other missions, then it's a spectrum. So Investments Unlimited is focused on financial transactions that have their regulations. That's definitely critical, and lots of banks have built some, what I'll call the kind of like half version of some of the stuff that's articulated in the novel. And then there's even more, like you go along that spectrum even farther, and there's critical systems where it's life and death, right? And so what I think people should realize, we're starting to talk about DevOps and automation, the rest of this, is that what is responsible when you're trying to put cat pictures on the internet is not necessarily fit for purpose when you have a mission that is going to be people's lives or financial transactions for that matter.
Yeah, definitely a different distinct mission set and set of requirements for sure. So the book is titled, a novel about DevOps, security, audit, and compliance, thriving in the digital age. So I wanted to ask you, especially like Andrew and Andres, both of you. So, what do you think has the book used the term bringing GRC out of the shadows and joining the DevOps movement? I think is the phrase it used. Why do you think GRC and compliance, kind of was left behind in the DevOps movement and didn't really keep pace with the way things were moving?
There's a couple factors. And so it's related to some of what I just said, is that in a lot of the early DevOps conversations, the people that are having those conversations are trying to build the big web. And they don't necessarily have the same level of governance. There's not really regulation in that space at the time. As you get into a certain level, then that becomes less true. But that was the reality of it. There wasn't GRC. Then you see these conference talks, and you're working in a bank or you're working in some agency, and you think it'd be cool to go do that. And so going back to the early days of Puppet, working with different 3-letter agencies or banks, you run into all these investments in automation, bottlenecking on security and governance at some point, right? So it wasn't until you got that tension exposed, because when you can't do things at a higher velocity, it doesn't expose what the rest of those constraints are. So I think what we're seeing now is that's becoming the more obvious constraint on the system. So if we want to realize all these returns on the investments that we're making in that automation, we need to remove that impedance mismatch with the governance and compliance and security side of it, or you're never going to get any faster, because you're always going back to that antiquated approach.
Yeah, I think you're spot on with that. Like, I work in the federal and the DoD space, most of my career, and like right now, for sure, the GRC, the compliance, the authority to operate, as they call it, risk management framework.
ATO.
Yeah, in our space, like you said, the velocity of software delivery has sped up, but the compliance process hasn't kept pace, and it's been clearer and clearer that it's the problem now. How about you, Andres? What's your perspective there?
Yeah, absolutely agree. There is this heritage of, well, it used to take us 6 months to come up with an idea. Well, we would come up with an idea, and to make that a reality, it would take 6 months for the lead time from our hardware vendor to supply us with the equipment we needed, show up in the dock, that would get racked and stacked, that would get tested, be made available. So a lot of the audit and inspection timeframes, they're modeled from how long the things used to take a decade and a half ago, not what it takes today. If I want to prototype an idea, I can shadow model, I can go get an environment from AWS and do that within minutes. So arguably, yeah, there wasn't the tension there, and it remains to be the last stronghold because things hadn't been done that way prior, but now they are. So a lot of those individuals who have a lot of knowledge and expertise on how things are supposed to look like haven't necessarily been exposed to modern development practices, or haven't picked up, like Andrew talks a lot about, where conversations with sysadmins at the start of Puppet would be really hard because they were very reluctant to learn programmability. It was like, hey guys, we're doing bash scripting. You're like tech savvy, you understand the systems, you're not writing code on daily basis, but you're running those scripts, you're just not checking them on a version controlled repository. So when we talk to auditors, people who have been around technology their entire careers, they just haven't picked up this set of tools and their toolkit to do things programmatically. So I think from the individual point of view, it's an opportunity where their knowledge and experience is more relevant than ever before. It's about upskilling, picking up new means, new tools to do more of what they're doing in a more effective manner and gain that efficiency. How do they catch
So I want to add to this point that Andres is making, and then kind of go back in time and bring it forward. So when you think about humans and like the forces, a lot of what we have to deal with in technology is actually the social engineering to get people to the new workflows. And there's a tendency for human beings to attach their identity to their tasks. So you have essentially institutionalized this problem by making it someone's job. And when you tell them they're going to do their job in a different way, they feel like you're erasing their identity. They feel like if those tasks go away, like, who am I? What am I? Right. And so finding a way to bring them into this new version as a hero in the story is kind of key to that. And then just to kind of like draw on the analogy that Andres was pointing out, this is like the historical evolution of this. When you go back to the beginning of the Agile movement, right? So I spent a lot of time as an Agile developer. I was invited to the 10-year anniversary of the signing of the Agile Manifesto at Snowbird. Like I soaked in that stuff for a long time. And there's lots of stuff that I've come to not necessarily reject, but like, I don't think Agile is fit for purpose for all things, but let's like look at why and what that represented in that time and place. So when the Agile Manifesto was signed, the majority of software was shipped on physical media, right? So you're talking about shrink-wrapped CDs or discs that you went to, a big box store often and kind of like took home and loaded on your computer. And in the span between the rise of DevOps and kind of Agile, in the early phases of this, I called everything Agile infrastructure. So it was like I was talking about applying continuous integration to my infrastructure and using Puppet and these kind of tools to do that. So that transition is because of what we'll call as a service or cloud, right? So if you go to the NIST definitions of cloud, it's all about this is a service, this is a service, this is a service. So at the point where software is running as a service, now those servers are a critical part of the value chain that they weren't necessarily part of when software was shipped on media. And so you have this massive bottleneck where you have agile iterations to write software, but then essentially a waterfall process to do deployments, right? And so the DevOps movement and a lot of what we were trying to change and why it was driven by building the big web was removing that impedance mismatch between agile, and then like a hard stop, and then like 6 months of accumulated code before it gets put on a server. And then there's all these other buzzwords that I think are basically part of the same phenomena, right? So microservices, continuous delivery, like this is all part of the same thing. If you think you could do microservices and continuous delivery without DevOps, you're gonna have a bad time, right? And if you're gonna do DevOps and you're not gonna try to move to these more cloud native architectures, like it's also gonna be a bad time. The types of architectures that you have will determine what you can automate and what will fail and what will scale in a very meaningful way. And so now that bottleneck is removed, and it's shifting everything to where's the next bottleneck. And if you think about exactly what Andreas said, in the beginning of this, when the Sun Microsystems was the thing, if you wanted to get a new thing, it was like 3 months of a PO, and then you get the servers racked and stacked, and then maybe some more handoffs, and eventually you get a thing. And in some enterprises and government agencies, it still takes months to get infrastructure set up. But in most cases, we at least have examples, the existence proof that that's not necessary, that you can have API provision, quote unquote, as a service infrastructure, platforms, what have you. And so then what's happened is that impedance mismatch with the GRC is stopping all the progress. And if we're not going to go bring them into the party and bring all of the concerns, and we don't want to compromise anything. Like that's the beauty of it. If you move to these verified attestations, you're actually going to be more compliant than you ever were before, right? Because right now, the reality of compliance is we put people through all this gymnastics on the front side, compliance toil to follow the policy, which in many cases doesn't make sense to the people following it because it's not been articulated in a way that they can comprehend. And then on the backside, you have all the audit toil as everyone runs around and like does the screen scrapes and puts together the spreadsheets, and sometimes that takes months as well. And so there's just a lot of waste in the system that we can reclaim and put towards the mission instead of the theatrics, while keeping stronger promises about what's actually done. Did we keep the promises we made to the regulators?
Yeah, I see in chat Janice Scott saying this is a shift. Absolutely right. And yeah, Andrew, like you can't do any of it without DevOps. You can't do it without DevSecOps, but you cannot do DevSecOps without sharing context with auditors and regulators.
Yep.
And bringing them along.
Yeah, I wanted to, something you said that really stood out to me, Andrew, is like, it's actually more secure and more compliant to adopt these technologies and processes. And that's something I've been trying to advocate since the government started adopting cloud and DevOps. Is like it could actually be better. It's more efficient. It's more effective. You're taking the human out of the loop. You're using machine readable, APIs, automations, like you talked about. How do we? Any thoughts on how we, and the book demonstrates this, by the way, but how do we get to bring that GRC workforce along for infrastructure as code, configuration and compliance as code, GitOps, declarative work models? Like, how do we bring those folks along and help them understand the value of the technologies and the new processes that can still meet their requirements and actually do it in a superior way, without them just saying, oh, this is how we always done it, or that doesn't work with how we do things. Like, how do we bring them along on that journey and help them understand?
So the real answer is some of them probably won't come on the journey. And the way that using the analogy that I just gave and what we saw with the sysadmins coming to DevOps or SRE or whatever you want to call it today, the thing that I would say is find the missions where this is such a necessity, and then match that with those people who want to do it a better way, and then use that to build the existence proof that draws the rest of the people along, right? Because if you go into an organization where they don't have that Darwinian pressure to evolve and move something forward in a meaningful way, then they won't, right? Like they'll only do it to the level of the necessity of the mission. So finding the missions where this is critical to unlock the potential, then you're going to have the chance to do it. Where if you just try to do it big bang across a bunch of organizations that don't necessarily have that pressure to evolve or that necessity to evolve, you're going to run into all the resistance. And I tend to so sometimes I quote people, and this is a Machiavelli quote, and it's basically this argument that one of the hardest things to do is bring about a new order, because the people that will benefit from the new way are only lukewarm supporters, where the people that benefit from the existing way will fight you till their end, right? So you have to find that seam in an organization, and sometimes there's inside of some organizations there's a big enough organization that you can demonstrate this in a small part of the organization, and then bring the rest of them along with that as the example, instead of trying to do it all at once, which I think tends to cause you more problems than it solves.
I think there's one more consideration there, which is the job can't be done otherwise. Like the scope to, well, sure, you can fill out a questionnaire, but like, are you really attesting the system that is humongous? Like, think of it, the scale that any agency operates, they have large distributed systems. Can you sincerely attest that all the controls are in place in a system that fluctuates constantly, that has huge rates of refactoring, and that gets repaved daily? If you're shipping code 1,000 times a day, building thousands times a day, how can you really prove with certainty that this is happening just by staring at it? It's like trying to make assertions of quantum mechanics. We cannot make predictions, or we cannot make any assertion of how things are actually behaving using traditional means. So there is the understanding of the limiting function of, you cannot do the job, you cannot solve this problem with sticks and stones. If you're dealing with web scale systems, you need to do it programmatically. You need to grow the interfaces that you can interrogate, and have the, like, remove yourself from the equation, let the machine do it, have it analyzed, and produce the evidence that you need to get through the audit to up to the board, and make sure that everyone understands, make certain like guesses of like, well, these are all the possible states. We do not clearly know what it is right now, but if there's a deviation, we can observe that.
Yeah, just said, remind me of a critical shift that I think we should also call here, which is there's the scale, which is causing problems because scale breaks everything. And then there's also the ephemerality, right? So I remember the time when people would brag about the uptime on their systems, and maybe they didn't have a lot of automation or whatever, but like you could at least go look at the logs on that system. When you're talking about containers that are being brought up and down and maybe only run for seconds, if you don't move to some kind of verifiable attestation model, you have no idea what happened yesterday. Sometimes you don't know what happened 10 minutes ago, right? So if you're not going to build out that attestation model, then you're just kind of flying blind.
Yeah, I think you both are hitting on the reality that like the old way of doing things simply is not sufficient. It's not going to work. The screen scraping, the sampling, the shadowing, shoulder surfing, the snapshot in time assessments, just not going to work in this kind of dynamic ephemeral environment that we have now. So you mentioned like the mission, and I don't think you used the term forcing function, but like Andres talked about regulation earlier, the Cybersecurity Executive Order. We have NIST Secure Software Development Framework that are calling for certain things around attestations and machine readable artifacts contracts, things that nature. What role do you think regulation plays here? And do you think it'll do more harm than good, or will it be a good thing?
This is a tricky subject, but I think that regulation plays a key role in a lot of this. At the same time, when people are legislating that the government can't buy anything that has a known CVE, then I question the understanding of that mandate, right? So finding this balance between, and I think what that speaks to, and maybe this is a shout out to everyone listening, like, go get involved in politics, because we need people at the highest level who understand some of this to drive those regulations in the right direction. So I think regulations are critical. At the same time, regulations for the sake of regulations without that contextual understanding don't always result in the best outcome.
Yeah. Any thoughts on that, Andres? I just wanted to add, I agree with him. I often kind of rant that we need practitioners involved in the policy making, because you can tell some of it just makes no sense.
One thing I'll shout out here, and this is like what I consider kind of the bright line between the enterprise and the cloud natives, is if you look at all these cloud natives that dominate the top end of the market now, they have C-level representation with technical expertise. That's not true in a lot of enterprises where you have CTOs who are MBAs. That's not true in a lot of the government stuff. So I think that is a critical thing. And then related to regulation, and I don't know how deep we want to get down this rabbit hole, but having been in part of and kind of like watched a lot of the federal programs, the way that these things get funded and then the contracts that get set up also contribute a lot to this. So when you think about, and not get specific here, but if you have a different company doing development and a different company doing operations and a different company doing security, like DevOps is hard enough when everyone works for the same company. When all those things have contractual boundaries and everyone's trying to kind of optimize for their own life, getting paid more and doing less work essentially, then it's like very, very difficult to get great outcomes.
Yeah, there's an argument to be made of like policies can play a role of values or virtues to strive towards, which is not necessarily bad to raise the bar. Like, you should have this level of rigor or try to drive towards this, understanding that may not be attainable. That disconnect, we see a mirror of it within every single organization. Like, we're talking at federal level, but if you look within the boundaries of your own organization, the security policy might be something that you may never do. It's unlikely, but you do have a group of people pretending that is in fact how we do things here. But people who are on the trench, like, know that, well, we have to pretend that, sure, when we come to the audit committee or the board, nod our heads, but we know that reality is quite different. So there is the call to action Andrew's making of get involved in politics, I do think starts individually within our own organizations. Make sure that we drive security policy to evolve towards what is realistically attainable. And based off that, we can create a healthier work environment where we're driving towards feasible outcomes, understanding what is it that we do it, not just compliance for the sake of compliance, and knowing that, well, that function, that tension between security and compliance, security doesn't have much value if, like, what is secure, right? So what is it that you're doing this for? And these things across the board may not necessarily make sense. Not every system is a mission critical system. Not every system needs 5 nines of availability. Not every system needs to be SALSA level 4 compliant. Some do. There's going to be diminishing returns if you try to do this for every single workload in your system. So at the same time, you don't want to over-rotate and everything becomes an exception, which is a lot of what we're seeing today. We talk a little bit about it in the book.
the risk model is key, right? So like the investment should be proportional to the risk. This is a true story, but I'm not going to tell the details. Just enough to make the point. But there is a it's outside of this country, and in their regulations they have like this data sovereignty problem, right? And they have to like keep things within certain borders. And they're showing me their architecture, and they were running things in a public cloud that was clearly outside of the boundaries of what that sovereignty requirement would be. And so I asked them, how did you get through the audits with this architecture? And the answer was, and I kid you not, we deleted those boxes from the slide. We deleted that like rectangle and that arrow from the slides. It's like,
yeah,
okay.
I think Andres has been kind of talking about using the term like machine readable, verifiable attestations is going to be the key to like having real proof and validation of requirements being met versus just, you know, self-assessment, self-attestation, you know, on a slide deck, like you just mentioned. So one thing I wanted to ask you both about too is, you know, obviously you talked about the friction, and the book touches on this too. Like, you know, how do we get organizations to also, and this is kind of an age-old problem with compliance and security, is like, you know, how do you to meet these requirements, but not impede velocity to the point where the business simply won't cooperate or collaborate because they have other objectives to accomplish?
That's the question, right? That's the, I think what's happening in a lot of cases, and like I said when we talked the pregame, I've been spending more time with banks than feds, but in a lot of cases, you have this tension between the central IT, governance, risk, and compliance, and the business units. And the business units are simply doing whatever they think they need to for their business. And when they're kind of like called to account, they're like, we print money, like whatever, right? And not everyone has that luxury, but certainly some of these banks kind of do. So like you have to find a way to make the right thing the easy thing. You have to find a way to align those selfish interests that those BUs and those developers have with the collective interests of keeping us safe and compliant. And if you can't do that, or to the extent that you don't do that, then you should expect those shadow IT pathways to route around you.
Yeah, Andrew, you've spoken about this more at length of the three economies. I don't know if folks have heard of the three economies. I would encourage you to look up The Three Economies by Jay Bloom, a PhD at Carnegie Mellon, that talks about that precise organizational tension we see in software organizations. You have business units, lines of businesses playing a game that in order to win, you have to make as many variances as possible. You have to differentiate from everyone else. That's how you win the market.
Want the 101 three economies talk real quick?
Yeah, just super quick. So central IT just wants to
first you need to establish two economies, and it's like game theory economy, not necessarily money economy. So you have this inherent tension between innovation and efficiency, and I've kind of reframed all of DevOps through this lens. So DevOps effectively represents that tension between innovation and efficiency. So developers are trying to create variation, operation is trying to control variation. And then the third economy, which is also related to a lot of the other stuff we see going on in the industry, is effectively the emergence of a platform where the selfish interests of innovation and efficiency come together to build something that is for the collective interest. And so that's the emergence of a platform that allows it's effectively a clutch, right? So connecting both sides, balancing both sides, so you can keep strong promises to operations while also enabling that innovation. And you see good examples of this in the cloud native. So I would argue that every cloud native effectively built these internal platforms that enable them to do these things, right? So when you look at the famous quote from Werner Vogel's, "You build it, you run it," that's 2006, the same year EC2 was released to the public. Internally, they've had infrastructure as a service with APIs for ages. They've also had APIs to do provisioning, deployments, all the rest of that stuff that we would call a platform now. So you build it, you run it is really just that top layer, the two pizza team running their software. They're not provisioning their own infrastructure. right? They're building on that collective platform that enables them to keep those promises. And all we're really talking about,
They're not compiling their kernel, as another example.
they're not building everything from source. They're not building their own software or hardware either, right? So when you think about what we're talking about with this governance, risk, and compliance and security conversation, is bringing the selfish interest of those personas, those security and compliance personas, into the platform, so that the platform can keep strong promises about security and compliance as well.
Yeah,
it is platform and methodology.
Yeah, and the workflows are critical. Absolutely.
On the public sector side, in DoD and federal, like this is manifesting in the software factory is the term they typically use. Essentially you're using IaaS and PaaS to abstract a lot of minutia away from the developer and just let them write their code. And like you said, kind of alleviating a lot of some of those underlying concerns and let them expedite like delivering value to their stakeholders.
Yeah. But how do you codify in the practice that there are multi-party reviews in place, partly enforced? How do you enforce that there are granular canonical identities across the board? How do you ensure that they're ephemeral builds? How do you ensure that those builds are reproducible, etc.?
Yeah, those are examples that the book is starting to pull out. So on that note, I was going to ask you about the book next. When is it scheduled to come out? I believe it's scheduled to come out next week. Where can people find it? And any thoughts on who would this book be a good who would be a good audience for the book? Who should check it out?
Yeah, great question, Chris. The book's releasing September 13th. It's currently available for pre-order on most online bookstores. You can also order directly from the publisher IT Revolution, same publishing house that brought you Phoenix Project, Unicorn Project, DevOps Handbook. The audience of the book is anyone working in and around compliance can benefit from it. There's quite a bit on how to navigate those conversations, how to navigate to drive towards these outcomes, wherever seat you may possess. There's many different characters. I think these are archetypical characters. There's a little bit of those people depending the role they're playing. And each of us as technology professionals, as people working, driving change towards whether you're an engineer, you're an auditor, you're a manager, there's something for everyone in the book. Andrew, did you enjoyed reading the book? What did you take away from it?
I would say, to answer Chris's question and come back to that there's anyone who's in a regulated environment has probably experienced some aspect of this. And so this is just a way to kind of like give you hope and try to evangelize the possibility this could be better. It's called Investments Unlimited. Someone just asked what the name of the book is in the chat. Investments Unlimited. And so it's framed through the lens of a financial institution, but a lot of the same practices and principles would apply to getting an ATO, which, a lot of the regulations, depending on where you're at, they basically come down to, are you doing what you say you're going to do, right? So at the simplest form, yeah, someone just posted, or you just posted the book in the chat. So that's, and for me, like I enjoyed the storytelling. I'm not really a fiction reader, but the fact that I know so many of these people and there's kind of like these call outs to all this stuff, there's just kind of like this collection of this zeitgeist that we've all sort of lived through over the last 5 to 10 years, kind of coming together in one narrative to move it forward. And I hope it helps people do that with their own work in their own organizations.
Yeah, I'm actually not a big fiction reader myself, but reading it, like I was able to resonate with, several of the characters, either entirely or like partially, like, yeah, I've experienced that. Yeah, I've been in this situation, that kind of thing. So, that said, for folks following along here, listening in, where can they find more of what you guys are up to and, follow you online or any other talks or events you have coming up, those kind of things?
I have, we're probably going to launch a new company in the next few days, and then I'm Little Idea on Twitter. Although I've been a little quiet lately, I'll probably be a little louder. I have a keynote at the SRE conference in Europe, in Amsterdam, in October. I'm probably going to do a talk at InfoQ. I'm not that hard to find. So if you look Andrew Clay Shafer on LinkedIn, I'm happy to have this conversation offline and private with anyone who wants. And the company that we're creating is specifically going to not exclusively focus on this, but the conversations, and John Willis is part of this, is to help people do this in a better way. Like let's move the practice forward in a concrete progression.
How about you, Andres? Where can folks find you, follow you along, and see what you're up to?
You can find me online on Twitter at invariantly. LinkedIn is another great means. I publicly share my email if you want to drop me a note. That's another great way to reach me. As for public appearances, it does look like a pretty packed second half of the year in the open source conference circuit. I am flying tomorrow to Ireland for the Open Source Software Summit in Dublin, Ireland. I'll be speaking about vexing open source software. If you've been tracking along software bill of materials and realizing some of the hopes and expectations we have SMOMs to bring us, where's the reality in that? What are the evolving standards? What are the future solutions so we can understand what vulnerabilities and how we can better respond to vulnerabilities found in software, what's present, what's not, negating false positives. A couple other appearances, DevOps Days coming up, Cairo. Andrew just extended an invitation to it.
I just added him to the program to fill in for a speaker that dropped out. Yeah.
KubeCon Detroit, that is our home turf. Cloud Native will be speaking about the role of cryptographically verifiable identities and how can we use that as the bedrock to yield a body of evidence, be it for better runtime security, defense in depth, or breezing through cybersecurity audits.
Awesome. Well, it sounds like you both have a pretty packed rest of the year coming up here. And I'm glad we got you guys on the chat, and I'm glad folks enjoyed the conversation. That said, you definitely know where to find them. And, Andres, just a quick note, he called out VEX, Vulnerability Exploitability Exchange. There's some great information out there from NTIA and CISO on their sites if you want to dig into VEX and what that entails around SBOMs too. So that said, thanks for joining us, gentlemen, and thanks for everyone tuning in.
Chris, don't forget Tom Alrich's blog, which is always a great source.
Great.
I'll shout out where I can. And
do
not disturb your feeling dread or pain regarding audits and compliance. There's a brighter future. We're driving towards it.
I think so. All right, gentlemen, take care.
Thanks for having us.
Cheers. Bye.